Hello, and welcome to your course on the art of public speaking. My name is John Hale. I'm an archaeologist at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, and it's going to be my pleasure to spend 12 lectures with you in talking about what I think is the most neglected skill in the entire repertoire of things that you can learn in the world today. Winston Churchill once said, "There is nothing like oratory," and to paraphrase him, he said, "It is a skill that can turn a commoner into a king." I believe that's true. I believe that public speaking is something that everyone should try to acquire. If you are a citizen in a democracy, you need to be able to speak in public. But also, if you're a member of a family, you will be attending weddings and be expected to give a toast to the bride and the groom, or a funeral and a eulogy for a dead loved one, or just a congratulatory speech at someone's birthday. All of these call for public speaking skills. In our ordinary life, there are times when you want to address a book group about a book that you've read, or talk to a neighborhood association about something important to you. There are times when you need to stand up in a courtroom or for a planning commission and make a case. And there are other times when you are simply trying to share your own skills, your own background to someone who might be able to give you a job. Certain professions call for public speaking. Lawyers, doctors, people in the military, clergy, all kinds of salespeople, business people who either need to sell themselves or a product or an idea. All of these are folks who are going to need to be effective public speakers, and that means just about everyone. This skill is often devalued. Lots of people think that public speaking is something that you shouldn't think about, that it's rhetoric or mere oratory. These are considered pejorative terms. Rhetoric is supposed to be fancy verbal flourishes that hide meaning rather than convey it. It's nothing of the sort. Rhetoric is as noble an art as exists on this planet. Rhetoric is the art of clothing in words and in gestures and in presentation to a group the ideas that you have in the most effective way possible. That's what rhetoric is. That's what oratory is all about. That's the skill we're going after in this course. The fact that you are here means that you are concerned about your skills as someone who can speak in public. It means that you have decided to take some steps, and that's the most important thing of all. We're going to have 12 guest lecturers in the course of our time together. I want to share this podium with the likes of Demosthenes of Athens, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Abraham Lincoln, many others. They will each be featured in a speech or set of speeches that made a difference to the world and to them, but more important, in my view, speeches which make a point. Speeches which help you understand more clearly, with a vivid example, something about public speaking. And at the same time, I, as the presiding professor who ties these 12 guests together, I'm going to try to be modeling what I think is good public speaking to you all the time. Now, what is my qualification to even be up here in front of this camera? I'm a teacher. And that means that early on in my life, I decided it was my mission, in my case, to speak for the past, a past which cannot speak for itself. There are other missions, there are other people, but that's my mission. Early on, I got over stage fright in a way that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, and I found that I was able to stand up in front of a group and present an explanation of archaeology that I had done or that I had read about others carrying out, trying to explain ancient monuments, ancient cultures, vanished civilizations. This had become my world. I wanted other people to understand it as their world. I was lucky to go to an elementary school which helped me become an effective public speaker very early in my life, to the point where now I think I've probably given I did add it up when I was preparing for these lectures, about 2,000 public speaking presentations. Most of them as lectures, as a teacher, trying to explain, trying to inform. That's one of the goals of public speaking, to teach, along with to persuade, to congratulate, to praise, to challenge, many others. But mine was mainly about teaching. This school that I went to, this public school, from 3rd grade on, I should give it credit, Green Valley Grade School, New Albany, Indiana, it had a tradition. Every class had to write, produce, and act a play, and every student had to have a speaking part. Well, the result was we all got over stage fright because everybody was in it together. We all had to be up there on the stage in the gymnasium, and I can remember the teachers in a row at the back of the gym shouting to us, louder, clearer, slower. I can't understand you. You're talking to the front row. You need to be talking to the back row. By the time I graduated from Green Valley Grade School in 6th grade, I, like the rest of my class, had become people who felt comfortable on a stage, felt comfortable talking. I think it's a great sin that this kind of training isn't given in every school, but if you are signed up for this course, it may be a skill that was somehow neglected in your early years. I'd like to try to share some of the ideas on how to get to this point of calmness and certitude with you. And I hope that by hearing from my own experience, by sharing with you, perhaps more to the point, the experiences and the words of these giants among public speakers, these historical greats, and finally by extracting from their words lessons, 3 to 6 lessons in each of our lectures, you will end this course with a greater understanding of what makes good public speaking, with a greater appreciation of what an important part of your life public speaking can become, and finally, with a feeling of much greater incentive to tackle the challenge of getting over your obstacles, getting over your fears, and starting to speak in public yourself. All of this is wrapped up in this world of rhetoric. You may also have heard of some special rhetorical terms that are used for forms of speech, modes of address. I'm less concerned with those. I'm more concerned with you. I'm more concerned with the kinds of situations you are likely to face as a public speaker. Now, the first thing we have to do is get over stage fright. There are other obstacles too. Our featured speaker today, Demosthenes of Athens, had a formidable array of obstacles between him as a young man who'd grown up way out of the world and out of public life, who determined to turn himself into a speaker, but the first thing he had to manage was fear. I want to read you an extract from a speech by Mark Twain that he composed in honor of his daughter, who was a contralto singer, and in the early 1900s, she gave a recital, and he gave a little speech after she finished singing. And he harked back to his own experience with what we call performance anxiety. Public speaking anxiety, PSA, is just a branch of performance anxiety, where the palms start to sweat, the breath seems short, the legs begin to shake, your mind goes blank. All of these things happen with performance anxiety. This is Mark Twain's expression and memory of his first speech. My heart goes out in sympathy to anyone who is making his first appearance before an audience of human beings. I recall the occasion of my first appearance. San Francisco knew me then only as a reporter, and I was to make my bow to San Francisco as a lecturer. I knew that nothing short of compulsion would get me to the theater, so I bound myself by a hard and fast contract so that I could not escape. I got to the theater 45 minutes before the hour set for the lecture. My knees were shaking so that I didn't know whether I could stand up. If there is an awful, horrible malady in the world, it is stage fright and seasickness. They are a pair. It was dark and lonely behind the scenes in that theater, and I peeked through the little peek holes that they have in theater curtains and looked into the big auditorium. That was dark and empty too. By and by it lighted up, and the audience began to arrive. At last, I began. I had the manuscript tucked under a United States flag in front of me where I could get at it in case of need. But I managed to get started without it. I walked up and down. I was young in those days and needed the exercise. And talked and talked. Well, after the first agonizing 5 minutes, my stage fright left me, never to return. I know now that if I was going to be hanged, I could get up and make a good showing, and I intend to. But I shall never forget my feelings before the agony left me. Mark Twain was one of America's most popular public personalities. It's very hard to imagine that a Mark Twain would have ever suffered a moment's uncertainty, self-doubt, indecision when getting up in front of an audience, but we have his own word for it, that he did. That he felt the same terror and shaking that all the rest of us had done. I want you to notice the things that he did, the steps he took in order to prepare himself for that speech. First of all, he made a compact with himself. He faced the fear, he faced the difficulties, and he said, I shall go through with this, and I shall go to the theater 45 minutes early to be ready. Now, this going to the theater 45 minutes early, that is very important. As we shall see in a later lecture, you always want to go and get to know your space. You want to see where you will be presenting. You want to try out your voice, although he does not specifically mention that, to hear it in the space so you know what it will be like when you begin to speak out and yours is the only voice suddenly there filling that auditorium. I don't know what it was in his mind when he looked at those people. Clearly, many of them he already knew. In fact, in a part of the speech that I didn't give you, he talks about how he had actually planted some friends in the audience with instructions to laugh at his jokes or support his points. I don't know that that helped him, but I do know that getting there early, getting to know the space, visualizing the space with him in it, talking, was a critical step toward becoming master of the situation. Then, he tells us that he had his speech written out. This is an important thing to do early on in your career. You want to write down a speech, and you want to have it with you. If you choke up, if you get scared, if you feel like you can't go on or can't remember it, do what he was planning to do. Fish under that little American flag. I think that's a charming touch. There was that bit of bunting there for him to hide it under, and simply go back to your written speech. He was ready for the emergency. What was the result of all of this forethought, all this preparation, all of that time being in the theater and speaking, if he was speaking before his own talk, and having the script ready? The result was, when he came to the moment, it took him just a short time to get over the wobbly knees, the catch in the throat, all the things that make you feel you can't finish this speech. And by the end of the speech, he was the Mark Twain that America then came to know as the most popular public lecturer in the country. It became a major part of his career. Mark Twain introduces us to the personal part of our course. I've divided these 12 lectures into 3 parts. The first part is about you, your experiences, your preparation, your character, your overcoming obstacles so that you become everything you can be as a public speaker. The second part is going to focus on the speech itself. We're going to be looking at examples of people who carefully crafted a message to the public and learn lessons from them about how to create that speech, the thing that Mark Twain had tucked under the American flag, that's the right speech for the right occasion. And finally, we're going to get you out there on that platform in surrogate form beside Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Mark Antony in Rome, proclaiming over Julius Caesar's body, and others, so that you get a sense of what it's like to face the audience and, above all, to think about the audience. There's a silly thing that's said as a first piece of advice to many public speakers: stand there and imagine your audience with no clothes on, or in the G-rated version, in underwear. I think this is terrible advice. You want to come to respect your audience just as you respect yourself and as you respect your message. That's what this course is trying to do for you. Get to that sense of respect for all concerned, that sense of capability. Now, the genius of rhetoric that I would like to have lead us into this world of speech-making is Demosthenes of Athens. I spent a lot of time in 5th century BC Athens. It's the world I love best. I've written books about it. I study its naval affairs. And there is one genius, Demosthenes, who at a time when Athens' fortunes were sinking, tried to revive his city's power through his own speeches. But nobody would have guessed from looking at him as a boy that that could have happened. Demosthenes was born to a rich family, but his father died when he was very small. He was brought up by the womenfolk in the family, which means he was brought up outside the public sphere. He did not go to the gymnasium with the other boys. He did not toughen himself up, get his lungs strong through running, get his body fit through wrestling, getting to know other boys and being part of society. He grew up alone with books. One of his books was the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, another Athenian, and at that time a fairly recent publication. He had a copy that he read 8 times. He memorized lots of it. And what he was memorizing in many cases were speeches. So Demosthenes' first step was to try to become a good speaker by opening up scrolls and reading somebody else's speech and committing it to memory. Because in Athens, if you were speaking in a law court or in the public assembly, you couldn't use Mark Twain's crutch of the little written out manuscript. You had to speak from memory. No one would respect you if you were reading from a scroll, as I've occasionally done now. The one time that he could read when he was up there was if he was reading somebody else's testimony or a piece of evidence in a law code or a treaty if he were talking in a speech about policy, national diplomacy, and negotiations with other countries. And just as you've seen me, and I'm trying to model and demonstrate works for you, just as you've seen me picking out other people's words and reading them, he could sometimes do that. It was an effective break in the speech. It helped him focus. It helped the audience to focus. Otherwise, he would be on his own. Demosthenes soon learned that he had some serious problems to overcome. His voice was weak. His chest was weak. Physically, he was a weakling, scrawny, walked around stoop-shouldered, with a frown all the time. He had a speech impediment. We don't know exactly what it was. It may have been a lisp of some kind. At any rate, people laughed at him when he spoke as a boy. And he knew he was going to have to get over that if he intended to have a career as a public speaker as a man. Now, all of this happened as he was growing up. He probably didn't realize that it was going to really matter to him to be a good public speaker until he turned 18, got a reckoning of his inheritance from his father, and discovered that his guardians had embezzled all of his money. The only way that he would be able to get his money back, the money his father had left him, was to go to court, and in Athenian courts, you had to speak for yourself. So he went down to the seashore where he could be completely alone and began a course of self-improvement to make him a man that people would listen to in a court of law. And he used a little prop, a little aid that he invented himself as a method for improving elocution. He used a pebble. To get over that speech impediment, he would put a pebble in his mouth, and he would then speak, working to get his tongue and to get his palate and to get his lips around that pebble so that he could be understood even with that stone in his mouth. He would take those speeches by Thucydides and others and gradually trained his own speaking apparatus, tongue, palate, lips, so that even with the pebble, he could still be clearly understood. In this way, Demosthenes overcame the first of his obstacles, the speech impediment. Second, he was aware of his weakness of breath. Near the seashore, there were hills. He began to run up those hills, declaiming speeches that he'd memorized until he got to the point that his wind was so good he could run and speak the speech and not sound out of breath. And finally, he went back down to the seashore and tried to be heard above the crashing of the surf on the shore, trying to outshout the waves themselves, so that when he got up in front of that jury of 501 people, or in front of the entire assembly of Athens, everybody would be able to hear him. There has never been such a concentrated attack on the art of rhetoric as young Demosthenes undertook while he was still a teenager. That's the reason he's a hero to me. That's one of the reasons that I picked him to be the first of our 12 guest lecturers to lead you into this world of public speaking and the practice and more practice that it takes to become competent in this field. He went to the court and he won his case. Then his vision grew wider. He wanted to speak in public. He wanted to share the idealism that he had acquired from reading Thucydides' history about the glorious days of Athens in his own time of decadence and decay. So he began to prepare a speech to deliver himself to the assembly. It was about reforming the Navy. He got up. He wasn't known to have had a great deal of experience, and his speech was very technical. There was nothing about his own opinions or life or feelings in it. It could have been written by anybody. And it made no impression at all. And this, I think, is another lesson we need to take from Demosthenes. Don't expect to succeed the very first time. Don't expect that your first speech will have them with Mark Twain rolling in the aisles, or with Demosthenes up there. He had hoped for a great show of approval from the Athenian assembly. Don't expect that. And don't beat up on yourself if you do fail the first time. If you fall short, you are probably your own toughest critic. Please remember, your audience wants you to succeed. They will have picked out whatever was good in your speech for you, and you just need to go on. Learn from the mistakes. Learn from what seemed weak or ineffective. He learned, within a year of his first speech, he was back on the podium. He had found an antagonist of Athens, Philip of Macedon, a king, the father of Alexander the Great, who threatened Athenian freedom. And Demosthenes, this scrawny youngster, decided to point the finger at Philip, show the world how he was gradually trying to take over the liberty of Greece and make it all one big Macedonian realm. By this time, he had become a sea captain himself, in charge of a warship. Now, this had a powerful effect on his credibility. He could speak from personal knowledge. I urge you to do that in every speech you make. If you're toasting a wedding couple, talk about your personal knowledge of them. If you're lecturing on a subject, talk about your own experiences with that subject. Please do not think that nobody wants to hear about you. In polite conversation, it's supposed to be a bad thing to talk about yourself. In public speaking, most of the time, it's essential. Let me give you a few of the samples of how Demosthenes used his new experience as a sea captain in crafting metaphors and images, painting pictures with words, something we will encounter with Chief Tecumseh of the Shawnee later on in our course, in order to grab the attention of his audience and help his own credibility. While the ship is in good condition, safe and undamaged, that is the time for the sailors and steersmen and the rest of the crew to take every precaution to safeguard it and protect it from being overturned by storms or sabotage. But once the ship has capsized, then it is too late for precautions. If we Athenians and the rest of the Greeks were overwhelmed by the lightning bolt that struck us, that is, Philip of Macedon and his armies. What action could we have taken? You might as well blame a ship's captain after his ship has been wrecked, even though he has taken every precaution and equipped his ship with everything that could help it pass safely through the sea. Yet the ship does run into a storm, and despite the captain's care, its rigging is damaged or destroyed. But I was not the captain of our ship of state, nor was I in command as general, nor could I rule fate. No, it was fate that ruled all. People remembered his words to their dying day. And that's another thing for you to consider as you plan your public speeches, be they short or long. Someone out there may find in what you say the words that crystallize a feeling, an event, a moment. And remember them as the words of Demosthenes were remembered by his fellow countrymen. He had worked for that position. He had strived, he had struggled in order to become someone that people would admire, someone that people would remember. In closer times than the 5th century BC to our own, we find other testimony to great speakers, both in the real world of history and in fiction, who do the same kind of preparation that Demosthenes undertook. And I'd like to consider a couple of those. One is someone you know very well, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, loved books. And every time he had a chance to buy one, he would go get that book and by the firelight of his little cabin there in my state of Indiana or later in Illinois, absorb what was in that book. But he had a favorite book. He had a book by a man named Scott that was called Lessons in Elocution. We're going to be hearing from this book as we go along. The important thing to know is it was both guides on how to present yourself, and it was a book on presenting you with extracts from great speeches, some from Shakespeare's plays, some from history, or just short little after-dinner aphorisms and anecdotes that you could practice on. It was his constant companion. The 6th edition, printed in Concord, New Hampshire in 1820, was probably the one that he owned. He wore it out. And to the end of his days, even in his presidency, he loved to talk with people about the speeches of Shakespeare and what they could teach us about statesmanship or diplomacy or the efforts to be a leader. So Lincoln, like Demosthenes, grew up in obscurity and tried to remedy that with work, systematic work at studying speeches and oratory. We find more testimony to this need to work at it in, of all places, the novels of Jane Austen. In Austen's novel, Mansfield Park, Jane Austen described a conversation between two brothers in a noble house, Tom and Edmund Bertram, about public speaking and how they were trained as boys by their father to be effective public speakers. They would memorize poems or speeches and deliver them there in the house while their father listened when they were home from their schools on holidays. This is part of an argument. The grown-up brothers are engaged in a fight because Tom, the elder, wants to put on a play at home with his sisters, acting very racy, somewhat sexually suggestive parts, and Edmund, who will one day be a clergyman, is very much opposed to this kind of private theatrical. Here is their conversation. This is Tom speaking first. Nobody is fonder of the exercise of talent in young people, or promotes it more than my father. And for anything of the acting, spouting, reciting kind, I think he has always had a decided taste. I am sure he encouraged it in us as boys. How many a time have we mourned over the dead body of Julius Caesar, and to bead or not to bead in this very room for his amusement. And I am sure my name was Norval every evening of my life through one Christmas holidays. Edmund disagrees. It was a very different thing. You must see the difference yourself. My father wished us as schoolboys to speak well, but he would never wish his grown-up daughters to be acting plays. So there we have a distinction based on gender lines. The boys of a great English house are expected to speak, whether as members of Parliament, justices of the peace, clergymen like Edmund, or, if there'd been a third son, a soldier going into the military, needing to address the troops as an officer. The girls are meant to be seen, but not heard in public. Today, we expect everyone to be able to speak for themselves, especially in a democracy. So, let's recap the lessons we've learned today. And let's especially think of our hero, Demosthenes, the man who has led us into this world of public speaking and wants us to understand what will take us along the road in our first steps. Number one of his lessons, make up your mind that you can and will overcome fears and obstacles. Second, practice, practice, practice every aspect of public speaking. Third, use cross-training in acting, sports, and other fields to improve your skills. Fourth, work on memorization. Fifth, accept early failures and persist with your efforts. If you can take these initial steps, you will be following in the footsteps of Demosthenes himself, a man who had more obstacles against him as far as pursuing a career in public speaking than any other major historic figure known to us, and who yet, through his persistence and his belief in himself, overcame them all. Welcome back. The hero of our first lecture on the art of public speaking was Demosthenes of Athens. He was once asked by an admirer, after he'd attained preeminence as the greatest public speaker in the known world, what is the single most important element of public speaking? And Demosthenes answered, action. So they said again, well, what is the second most important element? And Demosthenes said, action. And the third? Action. Now, what did Demosthenes mean by this word we translate action? In the classical set of elements for good public speaking that was propounded by later speakers like Cicero in Rome, pronunciatio, pronouncing your speech, was everything to do with delivery. In other words, not the text of the speech itself, and not your own elocutio or elocution in pronouncing it as we think of the word pronouncing, but the way you got your voice and your body into the speech. And it's amazing that Demosthenes, so focused on the words, so focused on the text, still thought voice and body language were the most important. I mentioned in our first lecture that Demosthenes believed in cross-training, and I talked to you about a couple of examples. The pebble in the mouth, a very odd sort of exercise, working on a sort of secondary point, the clear elocution of the words. He clearly wasn't going to speak in public with that pebble, but his voice would ever after be more attuned to exact pronunciation, clear enunciation of the words because of the pebble. The running up the hill, the shouting over the waves, this was athletics brought into the training for public speaking. And I do want to say there's something about getting your body under your control that helps with public speaking. If you think about the number of times you've heard sports figures, male or female, on the television or on radio being interviewed, you have not heard any inarticulate ones. Whatever they may have to say, they feel very free and easy about saying it. And somehow the control of the body carries over. It is a form of cross-training. Demosthenes did cross-training in a way that may seem very natural once you hear it. He studied with actors. Athens was famous for having a great drama. It had giants like Sophocles and Aristophanes and Euripides who'd written plays in the generations before Demosthenes was alive. These plays were classics now. He went down to the theater and he apprenticed himself to actors who could talk to him about tone of voice, dramatic pauses, gestures, stance. They didn't go into facial expression because they wore masks. But everything that could be conveyed by the way you were standing, the way you were moving, gestures with the hand, that's what he was studying. Also, how do you project your voice to thousands of people without amplification? So, cross-training is important to us as we focus today on our topic, which is the use of the voice, the use of the body to reinforce your meaning. It's a fascinating fact that more of your impression on the audience is going to be made by the voice and the body than by the words themselves. You can completely undercut a great speech by reciting it in a monotone, by ending every sentence as if it were a question, or by being uncertain and monotonous in your gestures and your delivery with your body. At some point, television commentators were told they should use their hands. And so a certain number of stock gestures happen again and again. Nothing should ever happen that is not motivated by something in the words, but you will infinitely reinforce the impact of your words with proper use of the voice and with proper use of the body. We are going to turn to one of the giants of the American Revolution, the man whom Thomas Jefferson said founded the Revolution, Patrick Henry, who was speaking to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1775, trying to get his fellow members of the House to vote to join the Revolution. At this time, it had begun in Massachusetts. Everything depended on Virginia, the biggest and richest of the colonies, joining in. Patrick Henry gave the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in order to get Virginia off of its position of being on the fence and clearly behind the revolutionaries. By great good luck, we have a record from an eyewitness of what Patrick Henry looked like as he gave that speech and what he sounded like. Let's hear the words of an eyewitness. This was, in fact, a Baptist preacher who happened to be in St. John's Church on that day in 1775. The tendons of his neck stood out white and rigid like whipcords. His voice rose louder and louder until the walls of the building and all within them seemed to shake and rock in its tremendous vibrations. Finally, his pale face and glaring eyes became terrible to look upon. At the words, "or give me death," at the end of his speech, Patrick Henry plunged an imaginary dagger into his heart and collapsed back into his seat. You have to be careful on the gestures. There were things that must have seemed dramatic and exciting in 1775 that might seem to us over the top. Nonetheless, it's very clear that what got people so excited was the sound, the theatricality of his delivery. And as you will see when we go through a portion of his speech, he has built some of the elements into his own words with lots of repetitions, which call for differences in delivery in order to be effective. So here we go. We are in St. John's Church in Virginia. Patrick Henry, a bold voice, has risen to speak. He's already notorious for a speech that is remembered by us as the "if this be treason, make the most of it" speech. So they're all braced for something powerful. "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify these hopes with which the gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves and the House. If we wish to be free, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Sir, We are not weak if we make a proper use of the means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir. Let it come. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. When he finished, there was cheering, yelling, applauding, and an almost unanimous vote that Virginia would join the revolution. A lot of the power of that speech came not from the words, good though they are, but from what that anonymous observer told us, the passionate action, that thing that Demosthenes referred to, that put the words across. And as I tried to point out, you heard how he wrote into his own speech elements that would lend themselves to varied expression. In particular, it's those repeated phrases and repeated words. I'd like to stay on this one more moment with another example from a very different person, although equally a revolutionary, Oliver Cromwell. He who had Charles I beheaded after this King of England seemed to have betrayed the people's trust. He who then became Lord Protector himself, put in a parliament, and then became so disgusted with that parliament that he came down to the House of Commons and disbanded it in what is called the dismissal of the Rump Parliament in 1653. We have it on record that after hearing them debating that they would extend their own term so that they could continue to debate longer, he rose in a fury from his place, clapped his hat on his head, and began to stamp up and down, kicking and shouting at them the following words. Ye are a factious crew, and enemies to all good government. Ye are a pack of mercenary wretches, and would like Esau sell your country for a mess of pottage, and like Judas betray your God for a few pieces of money. Ye have no more religion than my horse. Gold is your God. Which of you have not bartered your conscience for bribes? You, who were deputed here by the people to get grievances redressed, are become the greatest grievance. I command ye, therefore, upon the peril of your lives, to depart immediately out of this place. Go, get you out, in the name of God, go. That was a section of a speech in which the go, get you gone, was repeated again and again, each time we can imagine accompanied by the stamping of Cromwell's boots on the floor of the chamber. And what made it so terrifying to all present was, of course, not the words, not the biblical invocations, which you heard were then later shared by Patrick Henry, as they will be shared by Lincoln and many others. All that artistry would have been nothing without the forcefulness of that delivery. Now, as we look at this expression of voice and body that needs to accompany the words, we remember Demosthenes' action. Action for him, remember, has two parts, the voice, the body. Let's talk about the voice first. It may never have occurred to you how many elements make up your vocal production in terms of coloring the meaning and the emotion of every speech you make. There's volume, pitch, tone, pauses, that is, silence. There's also the pace at which you speak, the accents you put on individual words, and finally the inflection at the end of a phrase. All of this is part of speech, and to some extent, you need to be making conscious decisions about how you are going to inflect your words in order to give them the utmost of meaning and force. Now let's start with volume. That's the easiest one. Just as in music, there is forte, loud, like this, and there is piano, soft, like this. If you were to give an entire speech, either softly or loudly, it would be intolerable. You have to use variety. You have to save the forte and the piano, the loud and the soft, for specific moments, or make your speech what a musician would call a crescendo, as Patrick Henry is said to have done with the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Then there's pitch. I'd like to spend a bit of time on pitch because it's what keeps our words literally from becoming monotonous. Monotonous, mono, one, tonos, tone, means you stayed on one tone for the entire speech, and believe me, it was monotonous. What you want to do is vary the pitch from low pitch to high pitch, with most of the speech given in a comfortable middle range, but with high pitch and low pitch used for dramatic value. I think we can get some instruction from Winston Churchill, one of the most famous orators of the 20th century, on this matter by looking and listening to a couple of clips where he is talking about issues to do with World War II. And in the first clip, I believe, is not setting us a good example. He's giving a list of things at the beginning, and he's hitting the same high pitch again and again. It becomes somewhat monotonous. It would be much more forceful if he would vary the pitch. Let's listen.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
He got wild applause for that, but think how much more effective it would have been if he had not 5 times hit the same high note at the beginning. It almost begins to get into the way of your understanding the words if they are all put on the same pitch. Let's return to that great speaker, Winston Churchill, now for an example in how to use everything from high to low and how to put different words onto different pitches when he gets to his climax. Here it is.
Not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, work together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
You could hear in that second clip, he was using the lower tones more frequently. I think that's always better. High pitch suggests tension in the vocal cords and fear on the part of the speaker, but he was also varying with some high stuff in the middle. And did you hear that's fairly monotonous stuff to begin with? Those lines where he kept the same pitch? That's to prepare you for an explosion of feeling and force and excitement as he begins to vary the pitch on every word. The way to go after this, I believe, is cross-training through singing. I love to sing. You may hate to sing, but singing can help you. I would recommend signing up for an amateur chorus or just singing in the shower, but thinking about the different pitches that you assign to the different words. Singing will also help you think about breath control, supporting your voice, projecting your voice to a large crowd or in a big space, and it will also make you think about enunciation, about the vowels and the consonants that make up your words. Cross-training with singing, I believe, is a great tool. I'd like to share with you one of my favorite passages from English poetry which a good composer has, I think, treated in a way that helps us see how you can learn to project words in speech, even through singing. The poem is by Adelaide Proctor, and it's called The Lost Chord. It was set to music by Sir Arthur Sullivan, most famous for his work with Gilbert and Sullivan as the musical part of a partnership that produced the Savoy operas. Here is Adelaide's poem. Seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I know not what I was playing or what I was dreaming then, but I struck one chord of music like the sound of a great amen. Sullivan, in his musical setting, starts as Churchill started when he was presenting that second speech in monotones to add force to the moment where every word, every syllable gets its own different pitch. Here we go. Seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I know not what I was playing or what I was dreaming then, but I struck one chord of music like the sound of a great amen. Like the sound of a great amen. Now, Proctor doesn't repeat the last phrase, but Sullivan wanted to, and he made sure that he varied the pitches so there would be a sense of climax and newness to the expression. That may have seemed like it didn't get to the greatest climax it could have. That's because we have a long way to go with this song. Sullivan is reserving, as you should, when you give a speech, your climax for the most important point. The most important point is her last words. It may be that Death's bright angel will speak in that chord again. It may be that only in heaven I shall hear that grand amen. I don't have a high C. Listen to Caruso singing this, and you will hear the proper ending to Adelaide Proctor's The Lost Chord. All of these lessons are actually more easily learned by singing than by continuing to speak and just trying to work on your pitch. Nonetheless, write some notes as you go into the text of your speech to remind yourself high, low, soft, loud, but especially when you want to pause. I often find that when I'm looking out at a big crowd and I've somehow gotten in a flow of words that hasn't let up for a while and the sound of my voice has been ceaseless, if I will simply pause, the focus snaps together again. Sullivan knew that. Every singer pauses before they hit his words, amen, at the end of each of those phrases. Now, in addition to voice, of course, we have the body. The most important part of your body as you speak is your eye. You may remember that Patrick Henry was famous for this. That observer that saw him give the liberty or death speech said he fixed the audience with a glare. He was staring at them. He was not looking at a script. He was trying to hold them fast, hold their attention. If you were looking straight into a person's eyes, it's very hard for them to look away. And the intensity of your meaning and your emotion will come through to them very clearly. I often try to find a few sympathetic people in the audience who seem to be smiling or nodding, and look at them, bouncing back and forth to the ones who seem to be in tune with the message. That helps me keep eye contact. But I also try to feel that at the end of every talk, even if there were 1,000 in the hall, I hope everyone felt I was looking at them at some point. So work on that. It means that you're going to need to get free of the script. It means you're going to need to look up at times. It means ultimately, ideally, you'll either have the speech memorized, which I don't really recommend as a word-for-word thing, or feel free to more or less extemporize your speech. Winston Churchill once said, said he had to write everything down. He had to memorize it with all of its inflections. Other people are able to, as he said, fly on unpinioned wing, extemporize as they go. He admired that, but the result is the same in either case. You need to be able to look your audience straight in the eye. Beyond that, beyond the eye, it's really the body, the limbs that we're talking about. First rule, stand up straight. Make the most of your height, whatever it is. You need to be standing tall, standing proud. Standing straight suggests assurance, conviction, pride. All of that needs to come across when you are speaking. Then there are the gestures. You shouldn't move unless it is inspired by or reinforcing a phrase or a word. If you have nothing exciting to illustrate, it's fine to just stand at attention and speak. But as soon as you begin to feel that there are specific words you want to emphasize, start using your hands. Use them as you would in ordinary speech. Don't work up a separate set of oratorical poses. Simply make it seem natural. Work with the rhythm of the words. Reinforce the rhythm of the words. Your gestures, the movements of your body, they should all convince the audience you're alive. Nobody wound you up and pressed the on button. You're a human being like them. And those gestures will help reinforce that impression. I think we can get some amusement now out of Abraham Lincoln's old book on the sort of lessons on elocution. When we see that book go against its own lesson about matching the unique gestures and unique intonation to the specific words, if we look on their suggestions, there were 4 illustrations, how you should stand when you're talking. Let's look at this bit of instruction and see what we can make of it. First, I want to reiterate, a correct speaker does not make a movement of limb or feature for which he has not a reason. But then they go on. They are talking now about the attitude, that is the position that you should put yourself in when you are beginning to speak. And this is what they say about the boy, the student who is in this class on elocution. He should rest the whole weight of his body on the right leg, the other just touching the ground. The knees should be straight and braced, the body inclining to the right. The right arm must then be held out, with the palm open, the fingers straight and close, the thumb almost as distant from them as it will go, and the flat of the hand neither horizontal nor vertical, but exactly between both. When the pupil has pronounced one sentence, the hand, as if lifeless, must drop down to the side, and the body, without altering the place of the feet, poise itself on the left leg, while the left hand raises itself into exactly the same position as the right was before. This seems to me a perfect example of what not to do with your body when talking. According to Scott's lessons, you are then supposed to alternate every sentence back and forth, left to right. I think one thing they were trying to get at here was to encourage the student not to be standing there at attention lifelessly, staring straight ahead, but to engage both sides of the hall. Nonetheless, this is not the way to do it. Perhaps more congenial to us are the pages and pages which tell the would-be orator how he should compose his face and his expression, and also use gestures and positions of the limbs and the body to convey a certain kind of meaning. My favorite one is cheerfulness. Cheerfulness. Add a smile. I would say that should be your default setting. Even at a eulogy for a beloved dead member of the family, a smile is not out of place. And if you continually practice on letting a smile be your guide, be your standard expression, you will immediately draw your audience to you in a sense of sympathy and mutual good feeling. Let's go on for a few more. Joy. Clap the hands. Grief. I really wonder if this one was ever used. Beat the head, grovel on the ground, screaming, weeping, lifting the eyes. Remorse. This is after they've caught you in that financial or sexual scandal. Cast down the countenance. Courage. Steady and cool. Open the countenance. The voice. Firm and even. Exhorting as a general to his army. This one surprised me. A kind, complacent look. And finally, intoxication, eyes half shut, an idiot smile, an affected bravado, a heavy head. Well, we don't need to go quite that far, but all of these things can help us be more impressive public speakers. Don't forget, please, that you are needing to use your entire body, your entire vocal equipment in order to reinforce the words of your speech. So, let's sum up. We have a number of lessons that Patrick Henry and our other speakers are teaching us. First, use your voice and body language to reinforce your message. Second, always match your voice and movements to specific words and emotions. Third, at first, when you start out as a speaker, mark the tone and gestures into your text as reminders. They are as important as the words themselves. Fourth, establish and maintain eye contact with your audience. And fifth, and this one's just for me, in cases where you are not inciting a revolution, smile. Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to tackle one of the most important but most neglected aspects of public speaking, talking about yourself. There's a famous man in American history, Dale Carnegie, who trained hundreds, if not thousands of people in the art of public speaking, and he always said that the single besetting sin of most beginners was to talk in abstractions and to talk in impersonal terms, ignoring his mantra, which was, be yourself and let your audience know who you are. I'd like you to think back to Patrick Henry, standing there in St. John's Church and ending his fiery, revolutionary speech with a message that was from his heart and really very much about him. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. He was separating himself apart from that crowd. He was speaking from the heart. He was hoping others would follow, but he was really throwing down the gauntlet in the most personal way possible. We're going to be looking at some great speakers today who give us examples of how you should bring yourself into your words, how you should share your feelings, even your weaknesses and failures with the audience if you want to make the deepest connection possible with them. And our chief guest professor today is Queen Elizabeth I of England. We are going to follow her in her barge from her palace in London down the River Thames to Tilbury, where her army is assembling to try to fend off the most serious invasion threat her island has ever known, at least since the time of William the Conqueror, half a millennium earlier, the threat of the Spanish Armada. The year is 1588. The King of Spain, King Philip, has put together one of the largest fleets that the medieval and Renaissance world has ever known, with the idea of supporting Catholics in the country, and with a duke, the Duke of Parma, an Italian duke who is in the service of the King of Spain, pushing Elizabeth off her throne. It looked hopeless for England. It was up to her to put some heart into those men. And she did it perhaps in the most surprising way possible. She did it by talking about herself. Let's listen to her own words, and let's imagine the scene. She apparently read this speech. There's no reason to think that she didn't write it herself. It's very much of a piece with all of her discourses to her people. But she knew her voice was too weak to be heard all around the battlefield. I'm sorry, not battlefield, the camp where they were all gathered. So she had copies made, and captains read it out to their troops in every part of the field simultaneously. It was sort of an ancient PA system, but it worked very well, and it made everyone feel that they were really hearing from the Queen herself. My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and for my people my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already, for your forwardness, you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, in the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid you. By your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over these enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people. I want you to consider how strange a speech this is, coming from a commander-in-chief, where the key moment is when she confesses her sense of her own weakness. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman. By taking that tack, Elizabeth has drawn them in, drawn their sympathies to her, opened herself up to them, admitted her weakness, and I'm sure created feelings of courage and determination in that army that she could have gotten in no other way. So she is a model for us of how you tackle a very difficult situation. You are wanting to win sympathy. You are wanting people to know you right away. You're wanting people to believe in the same cause that you believe in. It's often not the right thing to just talk about how strong and how great you are. Opening up to people in public speaking as in private life is the way to establish a true relationship. This may have been the first time that a reigning queen of England had ever taken her forces into the field as commander-in-chief. She was in fact not going to go on board the ships, along with Sir Francis Drake and her other famous captains. She would wait on shore, but she doesn't let you see that in the speech. She talks about laying her own honor and life down in the dust, dying with them if necessary. And what she's looking forward to is that dreaded moment when the enemy might come ashore. She has pledged to them she will not run away. Their danger is her danger. Because she opened up about something that they must have all been wondering about, the feeling of fighting for a woman, a weak woman, not a soldier king, as they were used to with her father and her grandfather. She tackled what was on everyone's mind, and she made it a strength. If you will open up about weaknesses, if you will open up about failures, you too can create the feeling that out of these past failures and out of these inherent weaknesses and your struggle to overcome them comes strength that you can share with your listeners. It's a great way to get a crowd on your side. I remember hearing an incredibly inspiring sermon. Of all the hundreds of sermons I've heard in my life in churches, it's the one that certainly sticks with me most. It was by a Reverend George Mackey, who was the minister at our church in New Albany, Indiana, when I was small. A man who had grown up, it seems, in an odor of sanctity, of always doing the right thing. He was sort of the pillar of rectitude. But one day he gave a sermon about when he was bad, when he had failed to be a loving person. He'd been in the school where all of the future ministers were being taught, the seminary, and he was part of a group of healthy young fellows who liked to throw the ball around and go on long hikes. And there was one young man in the group they picked on because he was weak, he had no stamina, he didn't join in their games. So they pushed him around, they mocked him, they made jokes about him. One day they were crossing the courtyard on a cold winter night, snow on the ground, and he was overtaken with a fit of coughing, as he seemed to often be. And that somebody made a joke about it, and Mr. Mackey, among others, laughed. And then they saw that there were spatters of pink and red on the snow. He was coughing blood. This young man had tuberculosis. He probably would not live long enough to be the minister that he wanted to be. But he was there, putting up with all their abuse, putting up with their mockery, because he felt that was, whatever might happen, his mission in life. Well, that was obviously a life-changing experience for my minister, but hearing that story from someone I thought was perfect was a life-changing experience for me. There are lots of ways in which you can talk to people about yourself. It doesn't have to be just weaknesses. It can be personal things to you that help people understand you. I want to take another example of a great public speaker and another great woman in history, Sojourner Truth. She was a slave in America, freed before the Civil War, who, when the Civil War was over, felt that the big war still lay ahead, equal rights for women. In 1867, she attended the National Convention of American Equal Rights Association in the Church of the Puritans in New York City. So she's talking to a friendly audience. And she opened up about herself and her past and her feelings about the future. I am above 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be here 40 years more to have equal rights for all. Well, she was almost right. If she could have lived all the way till 1920, she would have seen the equal rights for women that she was hoping for. I suppose I am kept here because something remains for me to do. That sense of incompleteness, a job not yet done, something that is a mission that she has not yet succeeded in. I suppose I am yet to help break the chain. I have done a great deal of work, as much as a man, but did not get so much pay. I used to work in the field and bind grain, keeping up with the cradler. But men doing no more got twice as much pay. We do as much, we eat as much, we want as much. I suppose I am about the only colored woman that goes about to speak for the rights of the colored women. I want to keep the things stirring now that the ice is cracked. You can tell, just from that short excerpt, what a powerful public speaker she is. She uses images in a terrific way, as we'll see in a later lecture when we follow the Shawnee chief Tecumseh on his speech-making tours as he tries to unite all of the tribes. She has that gift, talking about now that the ice is cracked, or I want to stay here to help break the chain, of painting a picture in your mind so you remember things. But you also remember her. She uses pictures from her past life to make it vivid to you and to me. And the phrase here that just brings this little excerpt to life for me is when she's describing herself in the field, and what she's really emphasizing is the half pay for the same amount of work. But she can't give up on trying to convey to us how proud she is that in that drudgery, in that hard labor under the southern sun, where she would go along and gather up the grain and bind it in sheaves, she was following the man with the rake, who, as they say, was the cradler, who brought it together in rows. she kept up with him. And that little phrase, keeping up with the cradler, is that significant detail about herself, about personal experience, something that probably nobody else in that New York church knew anything about, that helps give this a feeling of authenticity. And that's something we always want to see in personal dialogues, in personal communications and confessions, the feeling of authenticity. It's something I think that public speaking can do for you. In fact, I think public speaking can make people better because it gets them in touch with who they are really. It puts them in a forum where they can really say anything about themselves and know that it will only add to the sense of authenticity, of communication, of revelation, and finally, of communication with the audience. Nobody's perfect. We all feel closer to people who we know through and through and who have felt confident enough to share their weaknesses and failures with us. Now, we've got people who have used their public speaking for statements of personal creed. One of these we're going to be visiting later on in our series of guest lectures, and that is Mahatma Gandhi, who in the 20th century was on trial for his life. And we're going to be visiting him for an entire spell, an entire session, making him our chief guide. But I want to sort of prefigure his appearance with us later on with just the opening of that speech, which I think is so profoundly personal and not only made an important statement for his judge, his English judge there in India as he's on trial for his life, but also to the millions that he knew would be reading or listening to his words. Nonviolence is the first article of my faith. It is the last article of my faith. But I had to make my choice. With that short beginning, he has said an essential thing about the kind of person he is. I also want you to notice the simplicity and plainness and directness of his language, something he shares with Queen Elizabeth and with Sojourner Truth in trying to open himself up so that you will understand him, you will understand what means more to him than anything else on earth. Now, as an example of the wrong way to present yourself in a speech, I would like to present the Emperor Napoleon, who took leave of his old guard there in France in 1814 after a series of defeats by a great army of allies, had captured Paris, and he was about to be sent away to the island of Elba in exile. He voluntarily surrendered. He did not fight to the death, either for himself or for this old guard, who certainly would have followed him anywhere. So let's hear Napoleon standing there in Paris, the old guard drawn up again for one last time in front of him, as he explains to them his feelings at this moment. These are soldiers he has been with for decades. He's bidding them farewell. Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have constantly accompanied you on the road to honor and glory. Now I want to say to you right now, this is a great start. That image of the monarch, the emperor, the general accompanying the troops, that they are the real leaders and he is just following in their slipstream, that is a tremendously powerful and moving way for the man who was briefly the most powerful human being on earth to talk to the soldiers who really made it all possible. The focus is on them, but they are getting the sense that he's opening up his heart to them, and through his own feelings, his own vision of himself, really creates a feeling of pride in these men who have in fact suffered a very grievous defeat. But things start to go off the rails pretty quickly. In these latter times, as in the days of our prosperity, you have invariably been models of courage and loyalty. With men such as you, our cause could not be lost. But the war would have been interminable. It would have been civil war, and that would have entailed deeper misfortunes on France. We're getting a little tortuous here in his effort to try to pay them a compliment, to call them invincible when they have in fact been beaten. He is beginning to have to do mental gymnastics that are clouding the issue, clouding that straightforward emotion that he started with so very effectively. But now we really go the wrong way. Right after saying this would have entailed deeper misfortunes on France, Napoleon goes on, "I have sacrificed all my interests for my country." Where did that come from? Suddenly the emphasis and the focus is on the speaker in the wrong way. He's wanting pity. He's wanting to be admired. He's no longer thinking about them except as an audience for his own revelations about how important he thinks he is and how wonderful he thinks he's been doing. "I go, but you, my friends, will continue to serve France. Her happiness was my only thought. It will still be the object of my wishes. Do not regret my fate." I mean, we're on Broadway shows here with "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina." This is bathos, that over-the-top kind of emotionalism, which starts to seem inappropriate and ridiculous. "Do not regret my fate. If I have consented to survive, it is to serve your glory." What? Well, he explains what he means. "I intend to write the history of the great achievements we have performed together. Adieu, my friends. Would I could press you all to my heart." It's a good ending from "Adieu, my friends" onward. But again, the idea that somebody has consented to survive when he had all along been saying we will fight to the death, and that he's doing it so he can go off to a place of comparative safety and write a book about what they all did together. This is really descending from the sublime to the ridiculous. He was a monomaniac. There's no doubt about it. He's not in the category of those first three speakers we heard. But as we consider that we've got two absolute monarchs here, Elizabeth I and Napoleon, we see how Elizabeth expresses through her own willingness to open up genuine feelings about herself and say nothing that's not true about this problem, that she has the body of a weak and feeble woman. She gets the sympathy of the crowd and the sympathy of posterity. Napoleon, although this is printed and reprinted as a great speech, seems to me to say much more about himself than he does about the men that he is supposed to be praising and exalting. My own experience with talking about myself has been that it transformed my lectures, my pep talks as a coach, my explanations of how to do things in the field for students into something that they pay more attention to and that they see more clearly, and that at the end we feel like more of a team. I can remember the class notes and evaluations that I received in the semester that I finally decided I was going to stop simply turning the textbook into lectures and use illustrations from my own fieldwork and that of other people I'd worked with at the University of Louisville to tell the students a sort of story about what they were going to hear based on my own personal experiences. Immediately, I found in the evaluations what I most like was hearing about my professor's own experiences. This gave me validity. This was an authentication of what made it valuable for them to be listening to me. This is always the question you have to think about when you are trying to convince people that you're worth listening to. Why me? What can I bring to this topic? Now, I admit I have it easy. If I'm giving a pep talk as a rowing coach, I used to be a rower. I can talk about those experiences. If I'm talking about archaeology in a lecture in a college classroom, I can talk about my own fieldwork and my own discoveries. But one thing I try to do is follow Elizabeth's example and talk about my mistakes and make it plain to them that they're going to need to learn from their own mistakes. I'm very interested in the fact that we often want nothing but success. The image that I like to use in class is that of a baby learning to walk. You cannot learn to walk from reading the books, studying the manuals, watching other people do it. You have to get out there and do it yourself, and you have to fall down. Nobody walks without falling down. And that's true of most enterprises in life. Nobody becomes an archaeologist without making mistakes. So, How do I illustrate this point about being willing to make mistakes? I talk to them about some of my own stupidities in the field. I'll give you an example. The first time I was put in charge of a field team there in the Louisville area, I'd come back to town with my Cambridge PhD in hand, very puffed up about myself. I'd been given the job simply because that particular survey required that the director be a PhD. I was the least experienced person in the field, if not in terms of all of the things necessary to do a dig, certainly in terms of that area. I had never worked in Jefferson County, Kentucky as an archaeologist. My field crew had been working there for years. Did I sit down humbly and talk to them about it? No. When we were assigned areas to survey, did I go around to the different farmhouses, say that I knew nothing about the area, but I would be grateful for information? No. Did I even take the trouble to go back through the records of previous archaeologists and study what they had found there? No. So I was set up for a fall, and I got one. There was a mound that we discovered back in some woods. Now, I had, at that stage, always the dream that the next thing that would happen to me would be the Time magazine cover, because this extraordinary prehistoric mound had been found, and the team from the University of Louisville would have excavated it and brought to light these things that rewrote the history books. That was my dream. Here was a big mound. Most of the mounds in Jefferson County were destroyed a long time ago, and so this seemed like a chance to find something unique. Now, I discovered that nobody else in the group was very excited about this. They had seen similar things. I was convinced this was a real prehistoric mound. It was sort of as big as 3 haystacks piled on top of each other. And so I made them settle down for 3 days in over 100-degree heat and about 98% humidity. We stripped the shrubs and saplings off the top of that mound. Now there's no shade to hide you from the hot noonday sun. We worked down in these textbook layers. And after 3 days, one of them pulled up from the mound a bicycle chain and said, "Was this the prehistoric artifact you were looking for?" And 1 minute later, we got a piece of plate glass and a brick. I was shaken. So I finally did what I should have done at the beginning. I went to the nearest farmhouse. I could have seen the roof the whole time, knocked on the door and asked about the mound in the woods. And I was told by the farmer's wife, "Well, that's not a mound. That's the big pile of dirt that my husband pulled up out of the creek with his backhoe when he was trying to channelize the creek so it'd flow better and we wouldn't get floods in the fields. That's just the stuff that he piled up." Well, my name was Mud for a long time, and they all enjoyed laughing at me about it. But I learned a lot. I approach every field experience differently now. I learned in a way that I could only have learned from a failure, from a mistake, from making a fool of myself. And I now have a story to tell to my students about my own mistake that can help them be ready for the inevitable mistakes they will make themselves. I learned a lot from a series of speakers that we brought to the University of Louisville and the way that they would present themselves to our students, to the community at large. We had figures like Jane Goodall who would come, who would always begin by talking about her own vision, her own childhood, how she got into the field, her work with the chimpanzees, what it meant to her. And by the end of hearing her talk about it, there was nothing you wanted more than to join with this seemingly frail woman who had braved the outback in Africa, who had done more to create a brand new scientific field, primatology, than any other worker, but had done it all with this spirit of modesty, this spirit of grace and quiet that was an entirely new thing in our lives. Sure, the points she was making about the necessity for conservation are good points, but what moved us was her own personal vision, her own story. So I remember going to a second lecturer, a second visitor. His name was Bob Ballard, big man in my field of shipwreck studies. He's the man who had found the Titanic. How did he begin his speech? Did he talk about the excitement of the day, the heroic moment when the Titanic was discovered there 2.5 miles down in the North Atlantic and all those mysteries were finally solved. No. He talked about his childhood in Kansas, the most landlocked part of America, how he yearned, even as a child, to have something to do with the sea, and how this Titanic and its discovery was the fulfillment of a dream that went all the way back to the time he was a little boy. What we took away from it was an image of a very human person for whom this discovery was a triumph, the kind of triumph we could all identify with. So let's sum up what we learned from Queen Elizabeth I, from our other speakers today. First, a set of lessons about being yourself, as Dale Carnegie said. First, explain your personal connection to the subject of your speech. You must have one. Figure out what it is and let your audience know. Second, share your own emotions, beliefs, and ideas. And don't shy away from revealing your weaknesses and failures. Third, establish a personal link with your listeners at the start of your speech. Think how Elizabeth I did that when she said her advisors had told her, don't go out in the crowd for fear of treason. And she said, I would rather not live than distrust you. There's a personal link. Fourth, use plain, direct language, but never, even if you are a monarch, talk down to your audience. And finally, a couple of general points that we get from Elizabeth. Fifth, don't hesitate to read your speech from a script if necessary. It can still be a very powerful experience for your audience. And finally, always make sure that your audience will be able to hear you. Because, believe me, if you are opening up yourselves to them, they will want to hear every word. Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to wrap up our first section of the course on public speaking, that section that we have devoted to preparing yourself to become a public speaker. And we've covered things like Demosthenes with his cross-training of athletic work and studying with actors, his determination to get over those speech impediments. We've also talked about our need to develop voice and body language control so that we can really make the best of our delivery as we deliver our speech. And then, just last time, we were talking about how you need to get personal in your speeches. As it said on the temple at Delphi in Greece that I study as an archaeologist, gnothi auton, know thyself, and I would go on to say, and put yourself into your speech. We're concluding our quartet of opening lectures with one about humor, one about jokes. Now, this is a very personal choice that you have to make, and in many societies it wouldn't arise, because many societies do not equate giving a public speech with telling jokes. But I have at home a little leather-bound volume printed in the mid-18th century, which is a tiny crib book that a gentleman could carry in his pocket to a dinner where he might have to make an after-dinner speech. It was to give him, ready to hand, a whole selection of anecdotes, jokes, humorous pieces on all sorts of different subjects so that he could shine as a speaker. Our obsession with the idea that if you're going to stand up, you're probably going to need to be funny is a very old one in the English-speaking world. But we know that other societies don't feel the same way. A friend of mine, who is a great enthusiast for Japanese art, told me a funny story about going to a conference of Japanese American culture, where the speaker stood up and said to all of this assembled group, some Japanese, some American, in America, it is customary to open a speech with a joke. In Japan, it is customary to start every speech with an apology. I shall pay a tribute to both traditions. I shall start my speech with an apology for not knowing any jokes. Well, it got a big laugh, it got things off, but it pointed out that this interest that we have in the English-speaking world for jokes and humor in public speaking is not universal. The actress Meryl Streep pointed out one of the reasons why you need to be careful in deciding where you want to go in this realm of humor. Once when she was accepting an award or a tribute, she reflected back on a recent film that she had made where she played, for almost the first time, a comic part. And laughing herself, ruefully, she said, "Dying is easy. Comedy is hard." She's right. You can't tell what effect your jokes will have on a given group. Often you will offend people more than you please them with a joke or with a satirical story. It's like a minefield when you get out there on that humorous terrain. And yet many audiences expect it. And I will say this now, and we're going to come back to this at the end of the lecture. There's nothing that unifies an audience more than laughter. So if you feel it in you to use jokes and to use humor, I would say this is that last element you're going to want to think of as you put together your arsenal of, well, we won't call it weaponry, but of tools as you start to approach your work as a comic speaker, if that's what you're going to be, but any kind of speaker. You may want to use this element, but you need to think about it in advance and you need to use it. I myself am one of those people that falls into the category of that man we just talked about who made the joke saying, "I'm going to apologize for not knowing any jokes." I'm not quite that bad. I know one. I'm going to tell it to you now. We'll revisit it at the end. You can decide during the time between now and when we get to it what possible application there could be for me, an archaeologist, in using this joke in every course I teach. I don't know what is wrong with my DNA. I don't know what's wrong with my mental processes. Jokes slip off my mind, and I've heard thousands, as food slips off Teflon. I just can't retain them. But I remember this one. It's a dark night. A policeman turns a street corner and sees in front of him, on the pavement, in the pool of light under a lamppost, a man on his hands and knees, desperately feeling around on the pavement, as if he's lost something that's a matter of life or death. The policeman says to the man, "Sir, what's happened? What's wrong?" And the man says, "I lost my wallet." "Let me help you," says the policeman. And he gets down on his hands and knees, and in a short time they've covered every square inch of that pavement and the gutter and the base of the lamppost, right out to the rim of the light. And the policeman stands up a little confused and says, "Sir, where did you lose this wallet?" And the man points to a dark alley well down the block and says, "I lost it over there." "Then why are you looking here?" And the man answers, "Well, the light's better here." Now, believe it or not, that has a serious archaeological message. I'm not sure it would fit into everyone's career as a joke that makes a point, but it does in mine. It's the only one I can remember. It always does get a laugh. I tell it at the beginning of my classes, and I get that laughter, that ripple of unanimous mirth that makes me feel the class is kind of pulled together around that joke. We'll come back later on and look at its meaning. What I want to do now is introduce you to our guest lecturer for today, American humorist Will Rogers. Will Rogers was a man who started as a stand-up comedian, had a very good career in films, was highly respected in America, so much that, as we will see, he was invited by Columbia University to be a speaker, an after-dinner speaker, at a very important event. The year was 1924. Columbia, with its President Butler in charge, had invited lots of their biggest donors, all of them alumni, to come to the college. They were actually honoring an old alumnus, Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, as a treasurer of the United States, was the right man to be honoring if you're going to talk about money. And when Will Rogers published this speech, and he almost never published his after-dinner addresses, they were off the cuff and not meant for posterity, he called it Education and Wealth. Here we go. President Butler paid me a compliment in mentioning my name in his introductory remarks this evening. I am glad that he did that because I got the worst of it last week. The Prince of Wales, in speaking of the sights of America, mentioned the Woolworth Building, the subway, the slaughterhouse, Will Rogers, and the Ford factory. He could at least have put me ahead of the hogs. Everything must be in a contrast at an affair like this. You know, to show anything off, you must have the contrast. Now, I am here tonight representing poverty. We have enough wealth right here at this table, right here at the speaker's table alone. Their conscience should hurt them, which I doubt if it does, so that we could liquidate our national debt. Every rich man reaches a time in his career when he comes to a turning point and starts to give it away. I have heard that of several of our guests here tonight, and that is one of the reasons I am here. I would like to be here for the psychological moment. I'm not here to keep cool with Coolidge, but to praise President Butler. Columbia was nothing 20 years ago. Now, President Butler has gone round and gotten over 100 buildings and has annexed Grant's tomb. Butler was the first man to go around to the graduates and explain to them that by giving money to Columbia, it would help on the income tax and also perpetuate their names. Columbia is the foremost university. There are over 3,200 courses. You spend your first 2 years in deciding what course to take, the next 2 years in finding the building that these courses are given in, and the rest of your life in wishing you had taken another course. That's about 2/3 of Will Rogers' speech, but it's enough to show us all the different kinds of humor that he brings in without ever, as we might think he would put it, stooping to tell a simple joke. One of those jokes that are impersonal, something not about himself, not about the occasion, but a joke with a punchline that people listen to and then burst out laughing at the incongruity or whatever it may be that is the source of the humor. I'd like to go back through this speech a little bit and look at the different forms of humor and the different lessons we can get from it. He starts deadpan with a long section about being thankful to President Butler for mentioning his name at the opening ceremony and his gratitude because he was badly treated, as he thought, by the Prince of Wales. We expect a joke coming, but we're still not getting it. And then we start to sense it when we understand the charge that he's making against the Prince of Wales, that this foreign visitor, in listing the sights of America, mentioned the Woolworth Building, the subway, the slaughterhouse, Will Rogers, and the Ford factory. Pretty honorable mention to be in that company, but I'm sure there was a big pause there while he let the audience try to work out what was coming, and then he used the brand of humor which involves crudeness, low language, in a setting where you expect everything to be prim and proper, with his sentence, "He could at least put me ahead of the hogs." Especially mentioning hogs at a dinner is something that seems a little incongruous, and that low language, that crudeness, very mild, certainly in our eyes, but stronger back in 1924, must have gotten his first big laugh of the evening. He then goes on for another setup. It's not a string of punchlines. Everything has to be set up. You can almost hear in this speech the pauses and the shifts of gear where he's moving into his next setup for that next punchline. Everything must be in contrast at an affair like this. You know, to show anything off, you must have contrast. That's a simple truth. It almost rates as another thing that used to be part of every speech, platitudes. Something that everybody would agree on, a sort of self-evident proposition that every speaker felt safe in making. But he's about to explode the platitudinous mood with, "I am here tonight representing poverty." Well, that's a funny thing to do. We talked about Queen Elizabeth exposing her weaknesses to view. Now Will Rogers is going to show you what he feels is his weakness, his Achilles heel. He's a poor man. Now, that's not the contrast yet. What is in contrast to him? The fact that we have enough wealth right here at this table, right here at the speaker's table alone. Note the repetition for emphasis. He's bringing them on board. He's building up that crescendo. And then a little parenthetical phrase, their conscience should hurt them, which I doubt if it does, so that we could liquidate our national debt. I bet that got a big laugh, because it probably wasn't far off from the truth. Columbia's graduates and alumni at that time numbered some of the most important and some of the richest men in America. They might have been able to make a dent in the national debt. And I want to point out something here about the nature of this humor. Will Rogers is playing the part of a court jester, something we're all familiar with from the Middle Ages, that privileged person who was allowed to entertain the company with jokes made at members of the company that would be completely unacceptable in a normal social setting. But that jester can get away with it because it's under the cloak of humor, and the laughter is felt to be in that same realm of laughter that we consider the special province of roasts, those ceremonial dinners where someone is toasted with jokes and barbs and witticisms at their expense. He's doing that same thing at these men who are in fact the guests of honor at the dinner, because they are the men, as you remember, who've given all that money so Columbia can grow as it's grown with all these new buildings. Now, he wants to set up again our next joke. So we go on with, every rich man reaches a time in his career when he comes to a turning point and starts to give it away. I think probably people laughed at almost anything Will Rogers said, but that's not humorous in itself. It's part of the setup. It's a platitude in a way. But he is going to be able to laugh at these people now freely, partly because, I want you to remember back, the first laugh was at himself. Remember that? He's laughing now at these rich men. They could liquidate the national debt. I think their conscience should bother them. I don't think it does. He's laughing at them, but he laughed at himself first. Remember our jester. He comes out as a clown. He's wearing caps and bells. He's frolicking around. He's often someone who just physically has some characteristics that people want to laugh at. Will Rogers makes himself acceptable as a person who can poke fun at others because he made the first joke at his own expense. I was put lower than the hogs and the slaughterhouse in the Prince of Wales Assessment of Sites of America. Now he's free to make jokes at others, but you should never laugh at anybody before you laugh at yourself, just to kind of tie in our being personal with this idea of the uses of humor in public speaking. We're now to every rich man reaching a time in his career. He comes to a turning point. He starts giving the money away. And he's heard that about some of the guests tonight. And that's one of the reasons he's here. And now his little punchline, I want to be here for the psychological moment. Well, that tips off the audience there that anybody who hasn't yet given, he's assuming now that the real reason behind this fancy dinner is so that people will open their wallets as they leave or their checkbooks and leave President Butler with a very healthy contribution to the Columbia Fund for new buildings. Now he goes on to the reasons. And I bet this got a laugh, even though it's not really funny. It's really true, but it sounds like a joke. These other things have been hyperbole. When he said that Columbia was nothing 20 years ago. Hyperbole, overstatement, comic overstatement. That President Butler has created 100 buildings and annexed Grant's tomb. More hyperbole. This is a very common form of humor, just overstating the case. He's gone to so much hyperbole that when you hear President Butler had the genius to go around to the alumni, the graduates, and tell them that if they gave money to Columbia, it would help on their income tax and perpetuate their names. I'm sure that got a huge laugh. It's the truth. And yet it's told as if it's a joke. It's in the context of the other hyperbole. He's not making many real jokes here. He is building up his information and his delivery of facts and the body of the speech, which is in fact a pretty serious speech in terms of its overall message about America, about education, about wealth. He's building it up into a series of punchlines that grow out of the material itself and his comic genius in structuring it for those moments of laughter. And then this lovely thing at the end where we get into the coursework. There are 3,200 courses. I don't know, that may be true. It sounds like a hyperbole. You spend your first 2 years in deciding what course to take, the next 2 years in finding the building that these courses are given in, and the rest of your life in wishing that you had taken another course. That's lovely. And one thing it does is something we saw in Elizabeth and in many other speakers, and when we get to St. Paul in our next section of the course, we'll hear it again, the importance of thinking in threes. You do it when you are making serious points. Here's Will Rogers doing it to build the crescendo for the comedy. The first 2 years, picking your courses. The second 2 years, looking for the building, and then finally, rest of your life wishing you'd taken another course. A big laugh at the end of the whole thing. So we've got here some techniques of comedy: the build-up, the surprise, the incongruity, the hyperbole, all of which are things that Will Rogers is a master of. But please notice, every single laugh that he evokes is making a point. Every laugh is helping to focus attention on the real substance of his speech. This difference between poor people and rich people and what rich people mean to American education, it's a very serious subject. And it's a subject so delicate, it probably couldn't be addressed at all except through humor. So Will Rogers was the right man for President Butler to invite if he wanted a memorable speech. Most after-dinner speeches are eminently forgettable. I'm sure the people who were there in Columbia University's dining hall in 1924 all remembered this for the rest of their lives, even if the jokes were at their expense. I like humor that grows out of the subject you're talking about. I often am talking about history. I found that there was one historical anecdote about the oracle at Delphi in Greece that when I told it, always got a laugh, as if it were that big payoff that people had been waiting for as they sat solemnly and patiently through my description of the archaeological work at Delphi and studying the geological setting of the oracle. Here's the story, and it helps that it's about someone that they know from history. It's about young Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great came to Delphi looking for an oracle. He was a very young man. He had not yet set out on his campaigns to conquer the world. He wanted a sign from the god Apollo, the god behind the oracle, speaking through the mouth of the woman who channeled the god's voice. She was the oracle. He wanted a sign that he was on the right track, that the gods were with him. And he got that sign when he went to Delphi. He came on a day when the oracle was nominally closed. The oracle was only open for one of the full trance sessions where the woman would channel the voice of the god in the crypt of the temple one day a month and only 9 months of the year. Well, he didn't come on one of those days, but he's Alexander the Great. And even though he was only in his teens, he wasn't about to be balked of his purpose by tradition or custom at this temple. So he went around the village of Delphi. He found the woman. He got her to the temple and was pushing her down the ramp toward the crypt when she turned to him and said, "Boy, there's no resisting you." And Alexander took his hands off her and stepped back and said, "That's the only oracle I wanted to hear." And he left very satisfied with the oracle he got at Delphi. Now, it takes the audience a minute to understand as they go back to what the Pythia, the woman who gave the oracle, said to Alexander, that he was interpreting her words as if they were the oracle from the god, and not in the temporary meaning of, quit roughly handling me, I can't fight you, I can't oppose you, but I don't want to be doing this. No, he took, there's no resisting you, as the god's word, you will conquer wherever you go. And that was almost the truth for his career. So there's then a laugh that comes both with the wit of Alexander in making this play on words and shifting from the sort of petulant teenager to the man who is treating this as the word of a god. Many different elements combine to make that a humorous moment, something that I always put in. And when I feel that laughter go through the room, I feel people are focused again. And it's not because I told a joke that distracted from the matter at hand, but because I turned something that was central to the whole issue into a source of laughter. You may wonder, does every subject lend itself to jokes, or at least to laughter and humor? We need to face the fact in our society that our ideas about solemnity and absence of laughter from great religious occasions or formal occasions is something not shared by the rest of the world. The Greeks were often ready to have laughter at their most sacred moments. They had a god named Dionysus who patronized the comic theater. Sioux Indians out on the American plains at their most solemn ceremony, the Sundance, which involved bringing dozens of tribes together in a gigantic temporary community with a great lodge in the middle for the ordeal of the Sundance, they would be awakened every morning of their ceremony, which went on for days, by a sort of crier, a bit of a jester, who would spend his time going through the camp and finding out funny stories and humorous anecdotes about the people who were there. And he would ride around the perimeter on a horse at dawn, both being the alarm clock to wake everybody up, and at the top of his voice, proclaiming these humorous anecdotes about the people who were there. When they were asked about this, the Sioux said, laughter opens the spirit to higher things. We don't have that view in our religion in general. Laughter is felt to be inappropriate in a solemn occasion, a religious occasion, a mystical occasion. Others have not felt that way. So I think we need to look to other traditions and see how gently they sometimes insert humor into some very serious moments indeed. I'd like to turn to a speech by a very important fighter, in a metaphorical sense, for rights. She is Burmese. Her name is Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and she, having won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, in 1995 delivered the keynote address to the NGO Forum on Women in Beijing. She wasn't there. She was afraid to leave her native Burma. So she sent her speech on a videotape, and the people, the hundreds of people in attendance, crowded in to listen to what she had to say. Her message was extremely serious. The world is in crisis. Half the world, the women, are still, in traditional societies, kept from contributing, and they're at the mercy of conflicts and wars that are created predominantly by men. Into this extremely serious discourse, she put a couple of very mild jokes. Let me give you the first one. She quotes a Burmese proverb. The dawn rises only when the rooster crows. You have to take a moment, as I'm sure Will Rogers' audience took a moment sometimes, but then you realize there's a double level here of humor. Silly rooster, so blind that he thinks it is his crowing that brings up the sun. But then you get, oh, this is about women, women's rights. The rooster is a male. We're seeing a masculine, a male take on the world, attributing everything, every great important thing to men. And I'm sure there was sort of a two-tiered laugh at that, and also the laugh that comes from surprise, not expecting her to make a joke. But she goes on quite seriously to point the moral of this. The dawn rises only when the rooster crows, says the proverb. But Burmese people today are well aware of the scientific reasons behind the rising of the dawn and the falling of dusk. And the intelligent rooster, another joke, surely realizes that it is because dawn comes that it crows, and not the other way round. It is not the prerogative of men alone to bring light to the world. And by that grand spiritual term, light to the world, evoking both the Buddhist faith, the Christian faith, Islam, all of these great religions, she makes that transition from her humor that got us open and laughing and feeling surprised that we could be amused in this way by her speech, to the grandest levels of thought and of inspiration. She's going to give another one in her speech. She's prepared us by giving us a little joke at the beginning. Here toward the end, there is an age-old prejudice the world over to the effect that women talk too much. If that did not get a laugh in Beijing, I would be very much surprised. But is this really a weakness? She's serious again. Women have a most valuable contribution to make in situations of conflict by leading the way to solutions based on dialogue. dialogue. So she took the joking little phrase, women talk too much, kind of turned it on its head. Women engage in dialogue where men engage in violence and in action, and drew a message from it. These, to me, are models of what we should pattern our own discourse on when we are giving a public speech and we try to work humor into what we are saying. Remember our Mark Twain, his talk about all the fear that he had as a public speaker for the first time, the knees knocking, his exaggerations of this and that. Remember how he is making a serious message too. Nothing is more frightening than stage fright. Nothing is more desperate for people who must get up and speak in public. And he is trying to help those who are going to speak in public get around that fear. All right, back to my joke. Our policeman, our man on the sidewalk, this strange claim, well, I'm looking here because the light's better. Notice I didn't tell the joke again. One danger of telling jokes is when you repeat them exactly, people don't want to hear them a second time. Here's the moral. We in archaeology look where the light is good. Places like Olduvai Gorge in Africa, where we've got 2 million of years of fossil data exposed by the chance that a river ran through. Is it statistically likely that where the light is good is where the important things happened in human history? No, it is not. We are always going to be needing to be prepared for new revelations in places where the light is currently bad and the darkness is probably concealing the most important clues to early human history. Well, let's wrap all this up by turning to some of the lessons that we've learned from Will Rogers and our other speakers today. First, laugh at yourself before you laugh at others. Second, comedy helps relax your audience, especially at formal occasions. Remember that Columbia dinner. Third, use humor to focus on your theme, not to distract from it. Fourth, jokes can illuminate serious points, providing new thoughts and perspectives. Fifth, as with every other element of your speech, your humor should reflect your own personality. You may be a person who doesn't like to make jokes, doesn't like to laugh. Avoid them or find the kind of deadpan humor then that you need, but make the jokes grow out of yourself as well as from your message. And finally, sixth, nothing unifies an audience quicker than laughter. I find I have a mystical moment when I'm giving lectures, when suddenly, and sometimes to my surprise, I'm not aware of having been funny, the whole hall will laugh together. And I feel a little circle of unity, like light, come out from behind me and go around to the back of the hall and click. And I feel we're together. Humor may not come naturally to you. Jokes may initially seem artificial and applied from without, but try them. Try that additional step toward reaching your audience, because once you hear that laughter, you will know that for the rest of the time, they are with you.